So today I'm gonna show you guys how to use ignition idle control. I find it's a very useful thing, and it helps with fast response or with engines where you have big cams and VVT or VCT or whatever variable cam adjustment, and it helps the engine from stalling when coming down with the revs. And I'm gonna show you how to set it up in Speeduino and in the EcuMaster. Sadly, I don't have my Speeduino car right now. I don't have access to it because it's over at a friend's garage, but you'll get the point. So how you'll start off is by physically going into the engine bay and either turning up the idle valve by hand or using the duty cycle table. And you can roughly turn it up so your idle sits at around 1500 or 1800 RPMs. It's way too high, but we're gonna lower it down with the timing. There's a few advantages and disadvantages to this, but we'll get to them. So first of all, this is how your timing table will look regularly. Okay, ignore the negative timing, that was for pops and bangs. So you see the timing at idle is roughly 17 to 18 degrees, and that's pretty close to maximum brake torque on most engines. So if you use idle advance additionally to 17 degrees, so for example you get 100 RPMs idle underspeed, so the ignition advance bumps it up to around 20 degrees, you will not see any difference because the ignition advance is already at maximum brake torque and the RPMs will not increase if the base advance is already so high or close to maximum brake torque. So what you want to do is pick the idle cells, and you can do some pretty coarse adjustments. You can try out 5 degrees or 7 degrees. It all depends on how aggressive your cam setup is or how hard the engine has a time holding its idle with AC or whatnot. The next thing you're gonna do is, here in Speeduino we have the idle advance section already opened. You find it here, but you'll probably know it already. It's reversed, how do you call it? RPM delta. Minus 200 means it's 200 RPMs above the target and not under the target. Some find it confusing, but I guess since it's not saying RPMs, it's saying RPMs delta, and that's always the difference between the two. So this means 200 RPMs over. What you can do is just try out like some pretty coarse adjustments. 200 RPMs, 10 degrees, 100 RPMs, like 5 degrees, 5 RPMs, 3 degrees, and the same for the other side. What you'll notice is that with pretty coarse adjustments, you'll get like some people call it ghost cam tune, or a pretty rough idle, and it can happen that it oscillates a bit more or less depending on what engine setup you have, but I think it sounds cool. So what we can do is I have it already set up in the EcuMaster software. It's pretty much the same. You go down to ignition table. So you see I have a base timing around, focus, 15 degrees, 16 degrees at idle. My idle valve is already turned up pretty much already. I did that before in the engine bay because the idle duty cycle that I have here, it barely affects the engine even with flyback diode. I don't know why. I think that's just SR20 stuff. My idle target is set around 1000 or 900 RPMs when the engine is hot. So we're gonna disable that before start. Here we have our ignition advance. Then we'll come down into the idle ignition correction, and I have something set up here, so it's 16 degrees with 250 degrees, 250 RPMs under speed, and 16 degrees for overspeed. You can just try it out, whatever you like. The problem is when you have very little timing at idle, it becomes very unfuel efficient, whatever you call it, and the lambda value will start to climb, meaning at maximum brake torque you have like lambda 0.9 at idle, whatever, and with the timing retarded or very close to 0 degrees, you will start to find out that the lambda value, it starts to rise, maybe till lambda 1 or even over lambda 1, because the fuel simply does not have enough time to fully combust. That means you have excess oxygen in the exhaust system. So I'm gonna set that to 0 so I can show you the effect of it. So the next thing we want to do is turn up the idle speed. I do it by using the manual adjuster. You can use the PWM idle valve or step by idle valve or drive by wire base position if you want to, but I just use this because my idle valve does not allow me to adjust as much as I want to. After we turn it up, let's see what we get. So as we can see, our idle is too high with around 1100 RPMs or 1200 depending. What we're gonna do to bring it down, our torque is 950. What we're gonna do to bring it down is use ignition control. So let's enable it. Starting with some pretty rough values. We can see it's not enough. Why is it not enough? Because we forgot to turn down the ignition advance in our idle cells. We're just gonna use like 5 degrees. And as we can see, we are roughly at 950 RPMs. Now let's turn up some lights. Idle is still at 950. Let's add the AC. And it's still at 950. So even with lights turned on, the blower motor and the AC, the idle still does not change. It just increases the ignition advance for more torque. It works just fine. See if it's stable when coming down from revs. Absolutely stable. Even with big cams and built engine and VVT, it's perfect. This is what we want.